One of the aspects and mission of this channel, and some of my colleagues over with Stinging Back and Caught in the Web and Just Played and Lady Justice Myth and Uncage Us on Facebook. All of those have this, we all have the same basic mission, which is to educate the public on what's actually happening with the proactive sex stings that police are engaged in order to bump up their numbers. In short, what they're catching here is not actually what is somebody trying to hurt a child. Not at all what's happening in many, many cases. Again, nobody's saying children are not being hurt, but it's very, very important when you are looking at our perspective and hearing from the police that if you're a member of Joe Q Public, you also understand that there's research in this area. And one of the best research groups out there, in my view, are the folks at the Crimes Against Children Research Center at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire. And they have published under Professor Janice Wollock, David Finkelhor, and Daphne Tenner, Ms. Yabara, and others, some really good work, I think, because what it does is it disabuses us of our notions out there, especially among those who have been led to believe by the John Walsh types and the Operation Underground Railroad and others that every time there's an interaction between a child and an adult online, there's trouble. And that's not actually what's happening. Certainly, there are questionable things going on, but this study lays bare some of the common misconceptions. So instead of going on for a half an hour, hopefully I'll be able to reduce this quite a lot. Let's talk about the stereotypes that this article breaks down. Again, this is a typology of offenders who use online communications to commit sex crimes against minors by Tenor, Wolott, and Finkelhor, as published in the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma. And this is in April of 2015. And what they did is they studied 28,000 plus uh, uh, police station data and did some anecdotal interviews of police officers. And then they narrowed those to 75 types. Okay, so they took a lot, 2,600, narrowed them to 75 specific types, of which they divide them into four subgroup types to talk about online offenders. But let's look at some general characteristics to begin with. First of all, they said they're not online, they're not adult molesters, they're not experts in seducing innocent children in order to sexually assault them in most cases. Okay. They're called names because it's easier to do it that way. Okay. While it's true that there's a subset of offenders, and we'll talk about those who are somewhat expert and pretty devious and horrible, the Jacob Wetterling cases, the Alicia of Alicia's Project cases, and others like John Walsh, the sad case of Adam Walsh. Those are the exception. They are not the rule. And unfortunately, a lot of innocent people are being caught up in these things who have no predilection to do anything with children at all. And I'm going to talk about how police may be reading this research just like we are. So if the typical offender is an adult male, younger than 26, so in the 20s, and we've already seen cognitively, delayed um, development of these young adults from child to adult, and that the judgment centers are not solidifying until about age 26. They're mostly white. So therefore they tend to if you're delaying your adolescence, you might be identifying with potential mates as somebody in the underage category. They contact potential underage victims online to seduce them into sexual relationships. They're usually females between the ages of 13 and 15. And as an aside, you'll remember the Washington Post June 2024. I think it's Seduced by the Badge and Betrayed by the Badge, I think is what it was. And it's interesting that in the 18,000 people that cases who were police officers who committed sexual Congress with young people, they were also girls in the 13 to 15 age range. So it's very curious that, as I've said over and over again, we do have a war on sex. We need to come to terms with what is going on, that between the ages of 13 to 15 and 15 to 17, we have many of these cases occurring. They're not occurring as a result of young people, however, going after adults, as the police have tried to put in their very aggressive decoys sometime. And I'll talk a little bit about where police come in a couple of minutes. In most cases, the adolescent knows the offender's identity and understands that the offender has sexual intentions. And sometimes they're even okay with that, that they seek it out. So it is not older people who are trying to go online, going after young people with the intent to have sex with them and manipulate them or grab them in the bushes, as is commonly portrayed. Now, do we have those cases? Yes. But again, when you study the issue, and this is just one of several studies I've talked about, it is usually something which is much more nuanced and not the onesie and twosies that you see out there in the news media. Because for every one of those that they cover, they don't cover these right here. Okay. Of course, everybody, all those cases they analyzed, the 75 ended in arrest. And therefore, they divided these into 4 different types. All of them were charged with statutory rape. And all of them were not, did not fall into the typical pedophile typology that the average and ordinary member of the public likes to throw out there, like on my channel and others. Okay. They also don't tend to be violent, impulsive, or have histories of violence or have criminal backgrounds. That's very, very important. So when the police are telling you that these are bad people and they're pedophiles, that is them getting ahead of the game, putting the cart before the horse and putting the conviction out there before the person even has a chance, if it's even possible by then, to have a fair trial in the court system. So they talk about 4 different types of online presences, let's say, okay? And very few combine CP with their online offending. But they do base this on, an incomplete stats, and they talk about that. Again, it's roughly 75 cases. They contacted 2,600 law enforcement agencies. I mentioned 2,653. And it's based on their data for the year 2009, and they received an 86% response rate. Okay. And most were male offenders to female victims, and mostly in the age category I mentioned, although it was the most extreme case they had was a 65-year-old interested in a 17-year-old. But that, they point out, was exceedingly rare. Okay. Offenders brought up sexual interests fairly soon, but not always. So some of them, they all use multiple and sophisticated ways, some of them rather, to deceive their victims. Okay. And here's what's really interesting before I get to the typology here. I'm going to read you what they said about one offender and see if this doesn't sound familiar. I'll read it directly. For example, in one case, the offender created 2 fictitious social network profiles. Sorry about that. Outside my window, like Detective Bauer did with me. He first began talking online to the victim using a 13-year-old bisexual female profile that he had created. The victim fell in love with the 13-year-old persona that this adult created, who eventually asked the victim to send sexual pictures, which she did. A lot of cases we're talking about that turning out to be sextortion, but this is exactly what police do. Exactly. The offender then used and then they go to the media and say, oh, they sent pictures. They never say that they asked for pictures. And when they asked for pictures, when they were underage, not age of majority. Reading further in the study, the offender then used another 14-year-old female profile and told the victim that the 13-year-old was now in a coma. The 14-year-old persona became friends with the victim and introduced her to the offender's actual profile. The victim accepted his friend request, never knowing that he was also the 13-year-old in the coma and the 14-year-old persona, the introductor, she thought she had been talking to. That's exactly what police do online. Are they reading this research? They come in with a decoy that's often 13 to 15. They lead the conversation. They push the conversation. They begin the conversation, meaning they often approach the person in question. And it brings up a real question. This is on page 8, by the way, of the study, a real question of why are police doing that? Why are they allowed to do that? Why are they doing that? This is exactly what they do. It's ironic and deadly accurate as well. So let's go into the 4 subtypes of offenders. 2 are more sophisticated, 2 are less. The first type of the 75, 32% of the 75 always had fake identities. They did not want to get emotionally involved. They targeted the emotionally vulnerable kid, the kid who has weight issues, self-conscious in lots of ways. These types, the expert groomers are called in the study, lots of CP. They want to meet offline as quickly as possible. They're very secretive, they're manipulative, and they can even be abusive. The second type that they identified is the cynic. 34% were in that category. They fabricate identities similar to the expert. They want to meet offline, but they're much less sophisticated. And very often they know the victim offline as well. In one case, a mother discovered the uncle was the abuser. The mother impersonated her daughter, met the uncle. The uncle showed up and he got arrested, which is kind of the way that you should do it, right? You should be directly involved in it. But that's something that, more parents should be involved in this. And I think it is less than what they should have out there now with police fabricating something. At least the mother was a real person. The next 2, though, are less sophisticated. The affection focused at 21% and the sex focused at 12%. The affection focused have genuine feelings of care and concern. They're not forced, they're not manipulated. They perceive their feelings as genuine, but researchers suggest that there's still a manipulative element here. They don't possess CP in most cases. The genuine affection starts online and can build to a relationship they may or may not have met in person. And some of them have even met and married their victims, so to speak. Now, I knew principal here, the principal who brought me to Virginia, seems to have begun his relationship when he was a young person who was a student teacher in his 20s, and his so-called victim would have been 17, but of course, no charges were pressed there. I knew in Miami another one, a music teacher, again with a senior who's probably 16, 17, 18, and carried on a relationship with the blessing of the parents and raised some eyebrows among us faculty, but he was never arrested and he was never charged either. This last one is the sex focused at 12%. As I said, they're upfront about sex, but they often use money or gifts to exchange for sex. The relationships are brief and they're really focused on the sexual element of it. And in these cases, too, we're finding that young people are also doing this sort of thing, young underage people, in a way to get their needs met that are non-sexual. So they will request money or gifts in exchange for sex. That is also showing up, not in this study, but in others I have read. And this is covered on pages 10 through 14 of the study. And the last 3, the cynic, the affection focused, and the sex focused, had no long-term rap sheets. So this idea that police come out, these are terrible people, they're awful, they're the worst of the worst. I've heard that mentioned as well. all lies, all untrue. Now, again, we want to get at a real understanding of what's going on here, but it is not the typology that the public would have you believe or that the media puts out there. Totally false. Okay. Of course, all of these are sex crimes. Of course, all of these people, the study goes on to say, were arrested, but they're part of a heterogeneous group. For the troll out there, this means that they're not of one type as you claim, throwing around the P word. Many of these people in the last two groups don't actually meet their victims either. That's another aspect of it. Many times, these last two groups don't actually meet anybody. And you have to wonder to what extent the I.C.A.C element is here as well. Now, I.C.A.C says, well, thank God we showed up or they would have met them. But of course, mixed into this, as we keep saying, that confuses everything is we don't know what would have happened because police showed up. And because police showed up and approached a person who was minding their own business, who claimed that they were looking for adult companionship, who talked about adult companionship and nothing but adult companionship, nothing would have happened, it seems, if police had not shown up and pushed, pressured, coerced, cajoled, as I've said, induced or enticed them or persuaded them to send pictures, as we see in these cases. How many of these people who are in the four typologies, I wonder, were I.C.A.C officers? Because what's really curious is what they describe in a scenario is exactly what cops do. Surely they are being informed by this research. So, they talk about this here on page 16. In most cases, offenders do not seem to be driven by deviant sexual thoughts and beliefs. Both affection and sex-focused offenders, those last two particularly, often are not aware of being sexually involved with underage partners at first. I wonder why. Could it be that I.C.A.C is working here? We don't know. But the typology interests these researchers because they're trying to say, too, that there's not a singular treatment plan, which you've heard me talk about in some other videos, that will work for them. In fact, it doesn't appear that they know very much about how to treat them. They said interventions for offenders should take into account the diversity in motivation and in relationship dynamics, and avoid treating them as a homogeneous group defined as, quote, child molesters, end quote, or rapists, quote, end quote. And this is out of Burgett and Bradford 2008 study, which they quote on one of the final pages, page 17. So there you have it, a little bit about how they understand different groups, how it is not what the public claims it is, and how it may well be influenced by I.C.A.C. That is my interpretation of the study in there. Let me know what you think. I will post it down below. Have a good day.